Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Gun Rights and Responsibility in America. My name is Kerri Raissian. I'm the director of the UConn Arms Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. I also recently had the privilege of co-editing, along with Jennifer Deneen from UConn and Cassandra Crifasi at Johns Hopkins, and also here with us today, a special volume of the Annals produced by the American Academy of Political and Social Science entitled Preventing Gun Violence in America, What Works and What's Possible. This journal is what motivates today's webinar. The journal contained 14 pieces of original empirical work and summative essays that outline the history of Americans' relationships with guns, the current dimensions and dynamics of gun violence in our nation, and how state and federal governments have sought to reconcile public safety with individual rights. The authors of this collection come from the fields of law, public policy, public health, medicine, psychology, sociology, social work, criminology, economics, among others. All of us, from the editors to the authors to the organizations that help produce this journal, want this work to be actionable and to inform practice. With that in mind, UConn's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, along with the Bloomberg American Health Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, have made this journal open access. It will be free to access in perpetuity, and the link to the journal is available in the chat. We're incredibly lucky that the Niskanen Center partnered with us to disseminate and promote this journal. They've made today's webinar possible, as well as a past webinar that focused on gun victimization. They've also helped each author team to produce a brief of each article, and the link to those briefs will also be placed in the chat for your access. And so with all of that, I'd like to add one more thanks to the Annals, to the AAPSS, and to Niskanen for making this entire project both possible and successful. Now for why we are here today. Let's go to the panelists. Dr. Cassandra or Cass Crifasi is an associate professor of health policy and management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and co-director of the Center for Gun Violence Solutions. As I mentioned, she was on the editorial team of the journal. She co-authored the first chapter, and she brings a public health perspective to today's conversation. Michael Ulrich is an assistant professor of health law, economics, and human rights at Boston University's School of Public Health and School of Law. He authored Balancing Rights and Responsibilities, the Role of Government and Citizens in Combating Gun Violence for the journal, and so he's a perfect fit for today's panel. I'm also thrilled that Jake Charles is our moderator. Professor Jake Charles is a constitutional law scholar focusing on the Second Amendment and firearms law. He joined Pepperdine Caruso Law after serving as the inaugural executive director of the Center for Firearms Law at Duke University School of Law. He's one of the leading voices in Second Amendment doctrine and theory, and is a true gift for distilling complicated jargon into something we can all understand, even on Twitter, no less. I am thrilled he's here today to lead this conversation, and I'd like to turn it over to him. Jake?
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I am absolutely delighted to be able to moderate this discussion today. Thanks again to the Niskanen Center and to Professor Raissian for inviting me to do this moderation. As I don't have to inform you, there's never been a more important time to have discussions like this. We have seen a confluence of factors that are influencing the gun debate in America. There are gun violence rates at astonishing levels. There is a surge of gun purchasing and a proliferation of firearms in everyday life. We have seen increasingly pitched and heated public disputes over the right to keep and bear arms. And in my field in particular, there are an increasing number of court decisions that restrict and limit the ability of legislatures to enact gun laws to protect public safety. And oftentimes the public debate gets flattened and it gets reduced to an either or, to a binary. Either someone is against guns and for gun regulation, or they're in favor of guns and they're against gun regulation. But as you'll see from the discussion today, the entire policy spectrum is a lot more nuanced. What rights and responsibilities gun owners have, what authority legislatures have, is much more nuanced than a simple question of yes regulation or no regulation. So I'm excited to be here and to be moderating this panel. Quick note on formatting. So each panelist will have a portion of time to do a presentation. After that, I'll ask a question to each of the panelists, and then we'll continue with the next one. And we will be sure to save a time at the end for questions and answers from the audience. If you do have any questions in the meantime, feel free to put them in the Q&A chat, and we will get to as many as we can. Some of those I might even bring up during the presentation with the panelists. So with that, I will turn it back over to Professor Raissian for her presentation.
Awesome, thank you. I have some slides I'm going to share, so just bear with me for one moment while I pull them up. It's always a little bit tricky, so I appreciate your patience. Sorry, it's not quite sharing the way I want them to, so let me click this little button. Okay, I think we're there. I think we're good. All right, so thank you, Jake, for those words. I want to start with just a little bit of context setting and talk a little about guns and gun owners. A quick introduction to this. First, caveat. We do not have administrative data in the US regarding who is a gun owner and who is not a gun owner. And so all of our comments today, I think, just need to have that understanding in place. And instead, we rely on survey data and other measures to infer or guess, in some cases, about gun owner characteristics and also the number of guns in circulation. I don't want to mislead you. I think we have some very good data on this, but I do just want to underscore that we use survey and other techniques to get at some of the numbers that you'll see today. So here are some things that we know or that we think we know fairly well from multiple survey sources. So we know that in the United States, there are more guns than people. We have a lot of guns in the US. We know that the number of guns in the United States is growing. We know that guns are not distributed evenly throughout the US, and they are not distributed evenly among gun owners. And we also know that the typical gun owner profile is changing, and in some cases, fairly rapidly. So who are gun owners in today's America? So most of the statistics I'll show you, I will flag for you when it's not from this paper, but are from the Berrigan, Azriel, and Miller paper that appeared in the journal that we mentioned. And so I just want to appropriately cite this paper and give those authors credit for this work. So they fielded a survey in 2019, and they found that 70% of gun owners were male. Over 65% were over the age of 45, and they were predominantly white. About 78% of gun owners identified as being white. They're mainly suburban, 49% living in suburbia, but there's regional variation. So about 44% are in the South, 23 the West, 22% in the Midwest, and 11% in the Northeast. So there are clusters or places in the United States where there are more gun owners than others. This is not in the Berrigan paper, but I think it's important for our discussion around policy, and that is that gun owners tend to identify as Republican or may lean Republican, less so Democrat, and independents are somewhere obviously in the middle. So I think that's important as we talk about policy and and how policy is perceived in the United States. We mentioned, and Jake mentioned in his opening remarks, that there's a changing demographic of gun owners. From a different paper, but also by Matt Miller and colleagues, that they fielded this survey from 2019 to 2021, there were 7.5 million new gun owners, or 2.9% of adults in America became new gun owners between the years 2019 and 2021. These are the years sort of straddling the pandemic. Some of this increase happened before the pandemic and continued through the COVID-19 pandemic. About 5.4 million had lived in homes without guns prior to this purchase. And the new gun owners were about half were female, but that's more than the 70% male we saw previously. So females are more likely to be these new purchasers, and the new purchasers are more likely to identify as Black or Hispanic. So you may see some images like this in the news showing a new profile of gun owners. So while the sort of older white male is still very much a sort of average gun owner, if you will, we're seeing some diversity in gun ownership that's important as we think about the rights and responsibilities, and also ways that we can prevent injury and reduce death among communities that may be new to purchasing a firearm. So back to the Berrigan paper that appeared in the journal, they then, after answering the question, sort of what does a gun owner look like, they think about where are the guns and how many guns are there and what does the gun stock look like. So in 2015, they estimated there were 265 million guns in the United States. And in 2019, they estimate 326 million guns, or a 19% increase. I don't want you to get too hung up on like those absolute numbers. I think the important thing here is that's a big increase. That's about a 20% increase. And if we think about the composition of gun stock in 2019, about 55% of those guns in circulation were long guns and about 45% were handguns. And they can also break that down further. And when looking at the orange here, the rifle, that includes AR-15s. About 7% of those are AR-15s, or assault style weapons that often are part of our public conversation. So I just want to point that out as the gun stock in case that's of interest to the participants. The other thing I think that's really important from this paper is that there's a distribution of guns among owners. So about 34% of gun owners in the United States own one gun. But about 23% of gun owners own actually 68% of all guns. And so that's a lot of what you might think of as a person who owns a lot of guns or has a sort of a super owner or something along those lines. They further sort of break down and say of people, so this first bar on the left is of gun owners that only own one gun, what kind of gun do they own? So about half of them, that one gun is a pistol, and then another 20% or so, it's a revolver. So about 70%, when a person only owns one gun, it's a handgun. And then the remaining 30% is some kind of rifle. And the green bar sort of at the top are your semi-automatic or military rifles. Their survey doesn't ask granular precision about the kind of gun, but that's where a sort of AR-15 that often dominates our policy discussion would be calculated or captured. As you can see, as we move through, as a gun owner sort of owns more guns, as we move to the right of this figure to the 6 guns, so the column on the far right are if a gun owner owns 6 or more guns, what kind of gun are they? They're more likely to start to own fewer handguns and more rifles. So the next question that I think is important to frame our discussion is, why do people own guns? And some of this actually comes from the Yamane paper, which Cass will touch on, so I just want to quickly preview some points here, is that a lot of people own guns for perceived safety. So the Yamane paper says that folks increasingly are motivated by self-defense in their gun ownership. And the percent of Americans reporting self-defense as a primary reason for gun ownership has increased. So in 1999, about 26% of gun owners would have said the primary reason was for gun ownership. And in 2017, that number had risen to 67%, saying that the primary reason was for self-defense. And 51% of Americans, according to the Yamane paper, and this is taken actually from a 2013 survey, 51% of Americans believe guns make them personally safer, and only 29% believe guns make them personally less safe. So that last statistic is not of gun owners, it's of Americans in general, and that's important to keep in mind. Also, papers within the journal themselves, and we can touch on this later if it's of interest, echo that this is true of those involved in what we might think of or term community gun violence or urban gun violence as well. So large populations of gun owners carry guns for their personal self-defense. But in reality, guns tend to not actually make people safer. In fact, they're less safe on average. This also comes from work by Matt Miller. That's a picture of him on the right. And this is work from him So Miller's research showed that handgun owners are almost 4 times more likely to die by suicide than those who don't have guns. Most gun deaths in America are in fact suicides, about 55% or so are suicides. And going from 0 guns to 1 gun, the risk of dying a violent death increases dramatically, not just for the gun owner, but also for the other people in the household as well. This is where I think the rights and responsibility part of this conversation really comes in to play. It's not just about the gun owner, it's about those that are around the gun owner as well. I just want to also point out that states with, I'm a policy person, so this is always of interest to me. States with permissive gun laws are certainly increasing. We had a paper in the journal that also looked at this and the effect of those gun laws on gun injury and gun safety measures such as homicide. This is the Donahue paper. And the Donahue paper looks at the sort of totality of evidence on these laws and finds that right to carry laws have increased violent crime in states where they've been passed, that defensive gun use, or what I'll abbreviate as DGU, is rare and occurs about 0.9% of the time. I will say I think this probably undercounts defensive gun use, especially in urban environments. So again, this is a statistic. We shouldn't put too much weight on this exact number, but I think it's important that we understand this number is low. Importantly, defensive gun use does not increase as right to carry laws expand, which is what you might expect would happen. But rather, gun carrying outside of the home increases, which increases theft, and the percent of robberies committed with a firearm increases after right to carry laws are passed in states. I think a much larger question for us to consider is, why do our policies privatize public safety? In a sense, I really think that's what's happening here when we are saying we're going to allow for private citizens to carry guns with the expectation that they are responsible for their own defensive safety through gun use. This is just a graphic to show where different permitless carry states may be. So permitless carry states are states that don't require a permit for a person to carry a gun. There are different kinds. There's open carry, concealed carry, et cetera. So this is just a map showing that this is widespread throughout the country. And Florida, as of July 1st, had changed their law from what this graphic is. So I want to just address this question. So are you saying we should get rid of all the guns? My answer is a resounding no. That is not what I am saying. What I am saying is that we need to think about responsible gun owners and the role that they can play to reduce gun injury and death. I think gun owners have to understand the costs and benefits a gun brings to their home and to their environment. And importantly, that the costs and benefits may change over time. So I was working with a family the other day, and a teenager in that house started to exhibit signs of depression. And they had an unsecured firearm in their house. And I said, you have someone that is exhibiting signs of depression. I think it's time that we talk about securing this firearm. And the family bought a gun safe. So I think, you know, it's important to also realize that context can change and be willing to adapt to those changing factors. There can be lots of tools that increase benefits of guns and decrease the costs. Some of those are gun training and safety. The person's going to want to use a weapon in a defensive situation. They need to be trained to do that properly. We need to have secure storage and be open and honest about that conversation and be willing to do that when it's necessary to not just protect ourselves, but others in our households and our communities. There needs to be conversations around aging, mental health, and appropriate use. Emmy Betts and colleagues, for example, developed the Firearm Life Plan, which can be found at firearmlifeplan.org, which talks about how to think about conversations as adults age and maybe dealing with dementia or other kinds of risks as it relates to firearms. And I think we should be open and honest about guns in our homes. For example, besmartforkids.org works with parents about how to have conversations if your child is having a play date and going to another child's house about how guns are secured in that environment. And the other thing I'll say, and that I'll end on, again, I'm a policy person, is that policy and practice must be informed by evidence. It's incumbent on each of us, policymakers, advocates, personal gun owners, et cetera, to understand what what is evidence-based, and be willing to have those conversations, and perhaps sometimes lay down our preconceived notions or, entrenched positions to have conversations about what in fact leads to safety, because I think that is the goal for everyone, that in fact we want to be safe, and we have to have conversations that embrace that. And with that, I will pause and I will stop sharing my slides.
Well, thank you for that really informative presentation. I'm going to cheat and ask a two-part question, partly stolen from one of the Q&A questions, which I think this one can be answered a little more quickly. Can you tell us about what were the reasons, or what was the dominant reason for gun ownership prior to the rise of self-defense becoming dominant? And
yeah,
then,
I believe it's hunting and sportsmanship and sort of recreational use.
And then a second, you talked about the profiles of gun owners, and you talked about gun owner responsibility. Can you say a little bit more about how the profile of gun owners changes over time and changes the mix of what gun owner responsibilities and rights are with respect to keeping their guns and keeping their guns safe?
Yeah, so I don't think actually it changes the result that much, right? I think secure. So if I could have one wish and wave one magic wand, and is a thing that all gun owners would embrace, it would be universal secure storage. If a gun is not in use, the gun should be securely stored. I think where it changes a little bit based on gun owner profile is understanding the needs of the gun owner, right? So my father was 86 when he died and had dementia at the time of his death. And so, my brothers and I had to have a conversation with him about guns and think about cleaning the guns for him and so forth, because he just didn't have the dexterity to do that safely. And when he had dementia, didn't have the awareness to really do that safely. I think it looks different when we have, increasing, for example, women becoming gun owners, right? What does that, women are more likely to be single mothers, or more likely to have young children in their household. And so what does that look like for secure storage? But I think this idea that guns need to be safe and secure when they're not in use is sort of the ultimate, is an ultimate place for me to really think about. But, with mothers, for example, unfortunately, women attempt suicide much more than other demographics. As they change to guns in their suicide attempts are ending in death more than they did previously. So having a conversation with women about mental health and about postpartum depression, or whatever those factors are that may be leading to increased suicide, and understanding that when we add more guns into their homes and their environments, that's just going to look different, is a conversation that we have to have across the continuum of healthcare providers, of each of us, like this webinar, of policymakers, of gun dealers when they're selling a gun, making sure that the person who's buying that gun has the things that they need to be safe when the gun enters their home, et cetera. So I just think I'm not sure that that some, it's the nuance, right, that you said in your opening comments. A lot of this nuance changes, but it's really about making sure the weapon is secure, so that when it's in use, it's done so safely, and when it's not in use, it's also done so safely.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that. And I will turn it over to Professor Crifasi for her presentation.
Great, thank you, and thanks, Kerri, for kicking us off. So I'm not going to use slides. I'm just going to highlight some key points for discussion. Some of what I will talk about comes from Dr. David Yamani's paper, Gun Culture 2.0, in the journal. But I'm also going to weave in a few other pieces. You might hear me call back a few points to some of the things that Kerri raised, and you might hear me foreshadow a few things that I think Michael might raise as well. But I think the most important thing to keep in mind as we're having this conversation and thinking about balancing rights and responsibilities of gun ownership is that the US has had gun regulations for as long as we have been on this continent, as long as we have sort of been actively using firearms in this country. We have had longstanding regulation, really to think about restricting access to dangerous individuals, high-risk individuals, or in sensitive places. Thinking about going into a city, a town, and having to turn over firearms to the sheriff while you were in the town and not being allowed to carry them around. This is something that we have seen pretty consistently. One of the things to keep in mind there, and not that this means that we should not consider these policies or should not retain some of these policies, but there were certain racist elements to these policies as well, and who was deemed dangerous often had a racial component, thinking about indigenous populations, enslaved persons who may have been freed, trying to minimize some of those access pieces. And so just wanted to start off by framing talking about gun regulation and balancing rights and responsibilities is certainly not a new topic in our country. And so Kerri talked a little bit about some of the harms associated with firearms. And I think from my perspective as a public health researcher, it's really important that we think about that. When we're thinking about minimizing harms, minimizing injuries, it's really important to keep in mind that there are lots of things that we're exposed to on a regular basis that can harm us, harm our families, and we often take active steps to minimize some of those harms. There are also some activities that folks might engage in that increase their risk because of some choices they might make. For example, substance use, consuming alcohol, those sorts of things. But we take steps to minimize harms, and that harm reduction approach, minimizing some of the harms that are associated with being exposed to firearms, is really important from a public health perspective, because firearms are exceptionally lethal. When we look at data from 2021, firearms were involved in a fatal injury every 11 minutes in 2021. So this is a really substantial burden, but there are things that we can do to minimize those harms. Safe and secure storage, for example, as Kerri was mentioning. I want to call back just for a moment to Kerri's talking points around COVID-19 and purchasing, because I think it's really important when we're thinking about some of the current motivators for why people are purchasing firearms, how they think about them in terms of self-defense and some of the culture that has evolved around that. As Kerri said, millions of people became first-time gun purchasers, and she talked about the shift away from 40 years ago, hunting and sport shooting being the primary reason for gun ownership, toward now around 2/3 of US adults who personally own firearms report self-defense as the primary reason. And I think it's so important to come back to this point, because in the tradition of hunting and sport shooting, if you want to get a hunting license and hunt out in public spaces, you have to undergo safety training. You undergo safety training, you have to apply for this license. And in that safety training, I've undergone it myself, many times that is a really core piece of education that people get around safe handling, use, and storage. I was having a conversation the other day, someone reflecting on a person behaving irresponsibly at the gun range, and they were kicked out of the range and they lost their membership because they weren't handling the gun in a safe way. The person had never had any kind of training. And that's a huge concern when we're thinking about all of these new gun owners who are owning guns for self-defense without a safety training requirement, not just around storage, but also around use. We need to think about some of the ways that people used to be exposed to some of that training and how we've lost that as we have shifted towards self-defensive gun use. I also wanted to mention thinking about a false narrative or a false sort of choice that we often hear when we're thinking about gun ownership, gun culture, and that is that if you own a firearm for self-defense, it can't be stored safely because you need to be able to access it quickly. But there are lots of strategies. If you talk with gun owners who promote safe and secure gun storage, there are lots of ways that you can safely store your firearm while also allowing yourself to have quick access if needed. So I just wanted to make sure to challenge that misperception. And really thinking about this, the development of a self-defensive gun culture, which, as Dr. Yamani talks about in his paper, the kernels of it begin in the 1960s, but really we see this shift, this gun culture 2.0, as he calls it, happening in 2010. And I think there are two really important pieces that happen to make that coalesce at that time. First off, Through the 90s and into the 2000s, we saw a real concerted effort to change policies related to carrying concealed firearms in public. In the 80s and largely into the early 90s, most states did allow concealed carry, but under very specific and stringent guidelines. And a good portion of them didn't allow people to carry concealed firearms in public at all. Fast forward now in 2023, half of the states in the US allow you to carry a loaded concealed handgun in public without having to get a license. That means no background check, no safety training, no application to law enforcement to get that license, which is concerning again around what kind of training people may or may not receive to then be carrying guns around in public. So we've seen this real shift over the last few decades away from a more stringent, restrictive concealed carry policy landscape to one that is much more permissive. In conjunction with that, the Supreme Court decision in 2008, the Heller decision, prior to that decision, we largely thought of gun rights as a collective right. We have a right to own firearms. I don't necessarily have a right. And that really shifted in the wake of the Heller decision, where for the first time, we were seeing an individual right to own firearms for self-defense as part of the Second Amendment. Those two things together, I think, came together to really contribute to the shift in prioritizing self-defensive gun use. Also really important to think about all of the advertising that went into that. If you look at advertisements in the American Rifleman from the 60s up through, into the mid 2000s, you can see that real shift away from hunting, recreation, and sport towards self-defensive, promoting gun ownership. And so it's just really important to keep those pieces in mind when we're thinking about the culture of firearm ownership. Also super important, we've talked a little bit in broad generalities, but we would be remiss if we left anyone here thinking that gun owners are a monolith, that they all think the same way, they all own firearms for the same way or for the same reason, and that they all think the same way about safety and policy. We know that is not the case. I personally own firearms, and I certainly do not speak for all firearms owners, let alone even all female firearm owners. And so it's super important that we understand the spectrum of reasons why people own firearms, how they engage with those firearms, but we need to normalize these conversations. Understanding these differences gives us also an opportunity to find common ground. Differences in sort of why people own firearms and what their perspectives are allows us to have opportunities to initiate conversations, to normalize talking about safe and secure gun storage, the way we've normalized asking a friend, hey, you've had a few drinks, maybe you give me your keys and you take an Uber home. Hey, it seems like you're going through a time of crisis. Maybe you should let me hang on to your firearms, or maybe we should lock them in a safe, or maybe we should temporarily store them in an offsite location. And really normalizing some of these conversations is going to be important, which calls back to that harm reduction approach. We know that a key piece of injury prevention is separating in time and space the potential harm from that which is to be protected. So in this case, safely and securely storing a firearm during a time of crisis might minimize some of the harms or give someone a moment to reflect before using it to potentially impulsively harm themselves or others. So I appreciate you all being here today. I'll pause there and see if there are questions that Jake wants to ask or questions from the audience that we want to chat about now.
Thanks so much. I want to pick up on one of the last things that you talked about, and you mentioned this a couple times. You talked about this false narrative of safe storage being completely ineffective for those who wanted to access their guns, and relatedly, this false narrative that we have of gun owners are on one side, have the same views on policy, and non-gun owners on the other side, and have different views that are also a monolith. So can you talk a little bit about what truth, if any, there is to this conception that gun owners view policy one way and non-gun owners view it another way? And then relatedly, we heard Kerri discussing the changing demographics of gun owners in the last few years. And I'm interested in if you have thoughts on whether that is going to change these groupings of what gun owners and non-gun owners view gun policy as.
Yeah, great question. To your first point, there's a lot that we agree on, whether you own a firearm or not, whether you identify as a Republican or a Democrat. There's a lot of common ground. And when we think about policies that minimize access to firearms by risky people, that tends to be a place where a lot of people coalesce. Now, I'm not in any way implying that there aren't people who think we should have no gun laws, and there are certainly people who also think we should have no firearms. But thinking about sort of the moderate middle, there's a lot of common ground. Things like requiring background checks for all gun sales, allowing family members to petition the court to temporarily separate someone from their firearms during a time of crisis, requiring first-time gun owners to undergo safety training. We see really broad support for those types of policies because we recognize this is a potentially risky behavior folks are going to engage in. And so how can we give people the tools that they need to engage in gun ownership in a safe and responsible manner? To the demographic piece, we have definitely seen shifts, as Kerri mentioned and as talked about in the journal article. We have seen a diversification of gun owners. And when you look, again, thinking about gun owners not being a monolith, when you look among people who own firearms and you look at supports for policies, programs, safe storage, whatever it might be, you do see some differences by demographic subgroups. Women who own firearms tend to be much more supportive of more restrictive policies than men who own firearms. African American gun owners tend to be more supportive of policies than white gun owners. And so it's important that we're recognizing some of these differences, and how we talk about policies, how we talk about solutions may need to change based on the groups that we're talking with, and thinking about some of these gun owners who are supportive of these policies, serving as credible messengers to have conversations that better resonate with people who also own firearms.
Great, thanks for adding that nuance to the discussion. We have some questions in Q&A, but I'll turn over to Professor Ulrich for his presentation, and then we should have some time at the end to get to the remaining questions.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I love everybody's work that's on this panel, so I feel very honored to take part. So my work, I'm a lawyer, so I tend to take a sort of legal lens to the issue of gun rights and gun violence, but I'm also steeped in public health, and that's where my primary appointment is. And so trying to integrate public health research and constitutional theory is really at the heart of what I do. And the important part here is that public health is inherently about striking that balance between thinking about population level harms and how to mitigate those, how to promote general population welfare, while at the same time protecting individual rights. And that's important to keep in mind, because then it's, what is the government's role in achieving both of those ends, protecting the public and protecting those rights? And in thinking about that, the question is, what then for the issue of gun violence can be done? And as was mentioned earlier, it's often framed by many as gun rights or gun safety, this binary, but really that's not true. There is a way to achieve both of those. And again, this is inherent in all public health matters. So one of the things that I want to start with up top is, the impact that Second Amendment rights have on other rights. Often what we hear when we think about Second Amendment rights is isolation on the individual and their ability to have a firearm, use a firearm. And really, it's important to keep in mind that the exercise of Second Amendment rights, even just use of Second Amendment rights, can impact the rights, freedoms, and liberties of other people. And again, this is not anything that is new, right? All rights tend to have an impact at some points on the rights and of other individuals. And really, this is at the heart of what government does, right? Is to figure out how to have that balance in an organized society. And rights have to be limited in some circumstance because of that. There are always going to be a conflict of rights, and so you can't protect all of them for all people at all times. And so, the idea that rights have to be limited in circumstances, Justice Scalia, for example, said in a non-Second Amendment case that this is just an unavoidable consequence of democratic government that must be preferred to a system in which each conscience is a law unto itself. Recognizing again that part of organized society is the recognition and acceptance that your rights have to be limited in certain circumstances. So the question is then when, how, what are proper justifications for that? And I think one of the issues that many people are struggling with now after the recent Second Amendment decision from the Supreme Court in Bruin is, does Bruin allow for these kinds of considerations? In that case, the court really focuses on history to assess the scope of the individual right, but largely ignores the state's interest in protecting the public. Again, this is an inherent part of the government. State governments have what's referred to as the police power to protect and promote general public safety, health, and welfare. It predates the Constitution, but that's a part of the history that the Bruin majority did not tend to focus on nearly as much. And so, part of the issue here is when we think about self-defense, there is the individual self-defense, but then there's also community self-defense, right? So in Heller, the court said the inherent right of self-defense has been central to the Second Amendment right. But the Supreme Court also said more than a century earlier that a community has a right to protect itself, right? And so what then is a community and the policymakers that they elect able to do to address gun violence? And again, this is because the Second Amendment jurisprudence is relatively new and underdeveloped because there's so few Supreme Court cases. A lot of this is still somewhat unclear. But it's important again to keep in mind that some people want Second Amendment rights to be protected. Some people want gun violence to be addressed, but many people want both of those things. And so figuring out a way to achieve that is really important. And gun owners can and should play a very important role in achieving that balanced goal ultimately in the end, because many people see gun violence as something that they are unable to sort of escape or get a handle on themselves. And again, that's typically where the government in general would step in and have a little bit more authority to act in the interest of the public. But as it is often in public health issues in general, proper framing, trusted messengers, as was mentioned earlier, and which voices are highlighted are often important. And again, this is really where gun owners can play an important role. They have to recognize that, part of responsible gun ownership is accepting that Second Amendment right is not absolute, that it is not limitless, just as all other rights can be limited in certain circumstances. And part of the aspect of that for the Second Amendment is not that that right is inherently necessarily different from all other rights, again, which are limited to protect the public, but that, to the extent that the Second Amendment connects with firearms in particular, those are inherently dangerous objects, and their presence inherently increases the risk. And again, the data shows that most people, including gun owners, understand this. So Professor Crifasi actually has another paper in Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics that gets at this point specifically, where even amongst gun owners, most of them said that they don't think that widespread carrying of firearms in public settings would actually increase safety, right? And so there's data from multiple sources to suggest that people trust themselves with their own firearms, but are less trusting of other people to use their firearms properly. And what that means is there is some acceptance that firearms are dangerous and risky. And so again, the question becomes then what can or should be done to sort of protect, again, both sides of the equation, both the rights of the individual and the public in terms of safety. The other thing that I think is becoming more important as Bruin extends the Second Amendment right out into the public is that gun owners can play an important role in, acting as trusted messengers. And for example, discussing things like vigilantism, right, and the desire for some people to go out as civilians armed and take on criminals or people that they think are potentially going to commit crimes. And part of the reason that this is important is the biases that inherently come with assessing who may or may not be a risk. And so you have racial profiling that happens not only amongst police, but again inherently with implicit biases amongst many people, most people. And so that can become a really dangerous thing. For example, data shows that most people think that Black males, even young Black males, are taller, stronger, more muscular, older, more physically imposing, more dangerous than their white counterparts at the same age. And again, that then can lead to fear of physical safety, which then could lead to snap judgments of, acting with a firearm, which really only takes a split second to make a very permanent decision. The other thing that I think is important is that gun owners can highlight many of the aspects of firearm regulations that they do support. Right, there is plenty of evidence to show that there has been widespread support amongst gun owners and non-gun owners for things like universal background checks, safe storage, increasing age limits to 18, from 18 to 21. 30-day waiting periods, right? All of these things. And again, also there's an overwhelming majority, gun owners and non-gun owners, against banning handguns, right? That has been fairly consistent for decades now. And so again, I think there's actually a lot more agreement in the public setting than we are often led to believe. One other thing that I want to mention is the other aspect that people who are gun owners and both want to protect gun rights, but also address gun violence, can show their support to non-gun related policies that can address gun violence, right? Things like increasing green spaces, improving abandoned housing, eliminating unmaintained vacant properties, making sure that people have living wages, quality education and housing, investing in communities of color and community programs that address violence and improve relations with law enforcement. All of these things can help to minimize and decrease gun violence without having any impact on Second Amendment rights. And so I think that is another area where there should be a lot of common ground and a way to pursue addressing gun violence while at the same time protecting gun rights. I just want to finish up by saying, that really much of what we hear is often at the extremes. But again, most people think that it is possible to do both of these things, to pursue protecting gun rights and achieving gun safety and minimizing gun violence. And so what we need to focus on is really highlighting those voices much more. And again, I really think gun owners can be an important, if not essential, part of those voices. And I'll just go ahead and stop there so we can have time for questions.
All right, terrific. And we do have about 10 minutes left. So if you do have questions, we have some in the Q&A. Feel free to put those in. I've got a question for Professor Ulrich, but maybe I can ask the other panelists if they can come on video. So after that, we can go through questions together and direct them to the appropriate person. So I'm going to take my moderator's privilege and keep our focus on the Constitution for a second, because it's my area of interest. There's a couple of policies that we've kind of talked about today that are popular, have support even of gun owners, majority support of gun owners, that might be imperiled by recent constitutional rulings. You specifically discussed constitutional conflicts between Second Amendment rights and other areas of rights. And I want to ask if you think the Supreme Court's most recent decisions leave room for this kind of consideration of these rights conflicts, or how it leaves room for that consideration. And if you think these decisions have created either an explicit or implicit prioritization of the Second Amendment over some of these other rights.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I hesitate to offer any predictions about what's going to happen in the future with the Supreme Court rulings, but I do think that the Bruen decision potentially puts the Second Amendment on a pedestal that no other right, even fundamental rights like speech and religion, have. Right? If we are literally going to freeze the policy options available to address gun violence in the 17 and 1800s, that's just not something that we really see in other areas. There are often adaptations, right? Fourth Amendment requirement for warrant for searches and seizures, for example. But all that is to say, I do think that there is space in Bruen to work. Jake, your work in this space has been very influential in my thinking on it. But to, for example, say, well, there's no history of laws that regulate large capacity magazines. Well, they didn't exist, right? And so I think that that is an area, right, where you could make a very strong argument to say that lack of analogous laws in sufficient jurisdictions is not really indicative that the scope of the Second Amendment is impenetrable in terms of large capacity magazines. I also think in terms of populations, right? So there's an upcoming case about domestic violence, right? And so I think you could make the argument that, yes, well, historically there weren't any laws, but also women, who were married to their husbands were essentially property, right? And so they could kind of, the husbands could do whatever they wanted. And so that actually is not indicative of the way that the Second Amendment should be looked at now. Racial disparities and slavery, right? There are a number of areas where I think that there's room. Whether or not the Supreme Court is willing to accept them is another story.
Great, thank you. So let me turn now to some more of our Q&A questions from the audience. I'm going to combine two questions here, and maybe Kerri and Cass, these might be more in your wheelhouse. One of the questions asks about this flip from hunting and recreation being predominant reasons for gun ownership to self-defense, and the fact that that started to change around the time that violent crime rates started to decline, and if you see any significance there. And then relatedly with this shift to self-defense as the rationale, what you think the effects on policies around safe storage will have on behavior change in terms of gun owners as they're highlighting this need for self-defense.
Maybe I'll start answering the second question first, which is, we often hear, as I mentioned before, concerns around the safe storage and self-defensive gun use sort of being antithetical. And often we're thinking about that inside the home. But it's important as we're thinking about self-defensive gun use and making it easier for people to carry firearms in public, that there are still in the most permissive states places where folks can't carry firearms. And thinking about guns being stored in cars, we hear from our law enforcement partners all the time. You send out a group of people, you lift enough car handles, you'll find open cars, you find enough unlocked cars, you're going to find unsecured guns. And so I want to challenge people to think outside the home as well, and thinking about how we need to be promoting the responsible side, right? People are very quick to talk about the rights, their Second Amendment rights, but we are too quick to dismiss or don't spend enough time thinking about the responsibilities that come along with that. Like if you left your keys in your car, now, I'm not a lawyer, so throwing this out there as a caveat, but my understanding is if you leave your keys in your car and somebody uses it and causes harm with it because you left your car unlocked with the keys inside, there's some liability there. If you are leaving your gun unsecured in a way that people can gain access to it, that's a liability and a responsibility issue that we need to be challenging. But often these laws with safe storage, you only hold people accountable after something has happened. But even then, we tend to not take it as seriously as we should. So I think if we were actually to enforce some of the laws we had and hold people accountable, like safe, cap laws, for example, a child gains access to a firearm and uses it. Some accountability there could help. And I'll stop there and see if Kerri wants to tackle the first part.
Thank you. So I want to say, going back to Jake's, I think, question to Michael, if Bruin, and I'm not a lawyer, but if the Bruin decision and other laws that may be sort of, around it, do dampen states' ability to enact evidence-based policy, then we're in trouble. Like, I just want to be really clear that evidence-based policies work, and they're very hard to substitute with personal action. That does not mean that we shouldn't do personal action. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look to people, being responsible gun owners, but there's not a great, at least that we found, substitute for policy on the scale in which policy can be effective. So I think that's an important thing to just put out there, that like, I don't know the answer, but if it's true, then we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do anyway, but we have a lot more work to do. Going towards this, violent crime going down and gun ownership sort of going up. I don't know. Honestly, I think in some sense this is an ecological fallacy as well that's happening here. We just don't see defensive gun use really rising in states that have right to carry laws, et cetera. We instead see things like road rage accidents or incidents with guns. They're not accidents, they're intentional incidents with guns going up. We see the exact thing that Cass just sort of laid out for us, with guns in cars and being stolen and then becoming used in other sort of violent crimes and robberies. And so I think sometimes I hear this argument that, people started owning more guns and that's what caused violent crime to go down. We don't quite see it lining up like that. We see a lag happening there in that phenomenon. And I think that we have to look individually and by states. The other correlation that we see is that states with stronger gun laws, with higher levels of regulation, tend to have lower gun death and injury. And we have to take all of these facts together to think about something that's, well balanced and will get us to the place that we want to be, which is less gun injury and death. And the final thing that I'll say before I hand it back to Jake, I know we're on a time crunch here, is that the United States has a really unique problem. I do think we can figure this out, but we have more guns than people, and we have a higher gun death rate than any other developed country in the world, right? So we have this point of American exceptionalism, and we are the only country that has to figure out this conundrum, which makes it hard to look to other models. So.
Perfect, thank you. I think as much as I want to get to more questions in the Q&A, we probably don't have time to get to them. So maybe I'll just turn it back to the panelists for a brief 30 to 45 second. If you have any last parting words on this focus on both the rights side of the equation, but also highlighting this responsibility side of the equation. And I'll start it in reverse order so we end with Kerri. So Michael, why don't you start off with that?
Yeah, so I'll just again reiterate, I think that really it is about messaging and framing, and I think that there's a deep disconnect between what policymakers are pursuing and what the public, including gun owners, want. Kerri has a paper, the same Journal of Law of Medicine and Ethics issue, which is really great, that shows, Second Amendment sanctuary law in Missouri was something that most people in the state didn't want. Even gun owners didn't think that it would increase the safety. And so I think that there's also a representative governance issue here, and that really creates a bigger divide and partisan issue than there actually is, again, in the public. And so I think finding a way to, bring in things like gerrymandering and voting rights and aspects like that, and making sure that policymakers are aligning their pursuits with what the public wants, I think is really important part of this too.
Thank you. Cass?
Yeah, I would actually just call back to a point that Kerri was just making about states with strong gun laws have the lowest rates of gun deaths, states with weaker gun laws have the highest rates, and the states that have the lower rates of gun deaths didn't do that by banning all guns and saying people couldn't have them at all, but by being very thoughtful about identifying and screening out high risk individuals, limiting guns in sensitive places like bars and other places where there might be alcohol and sort of understanding the association between those two things. And so I think it's possible for us to address our issue without talking about banning all firearms, but really thinking strategically about the evidence-based policies that we see in states with the lowest rates of gun deaths.
Thank you. And Kerri, bring us home.
Oh gosh, there's so much to say. I will just say, so there's the last question in the chat is about, are we going to address illegal guns such as ghost guns? Ghost guns are a huge problem. And again, sort of a way that illicit markets are evolving. And no, we didn't address that here. We were really addressing what we think of as sort of gun owners and legal gun ownership, and the way that legal gun owners have a responsibility to sort of prevent illegal and ghost guns and misuse of guns in situations. So that's a much larger conversation. I think it's really important, but was a little sort of outside of our conversation. We can't do everything in an hour. So we'll have to plan another webinar. With that in mind, I want to say thank you so much to everyone who made this journal possible, who made this webinar possible, and of course to our panelists and all of you who joined us from wherever you are. Thank you so much for being here and for being part of the conversation. Thanks.